Every species in the galaxy had learned how to fight. They had schools for it. They had simulations, textbooks, centuries of carefully organized doctrine passed down from one generation to the next. They studied angles of attack like poetry. They memorized fleet formations the way children memorized songs. They debated the ethics of orbital bombardment in clean, air-conditioned lecture halls while sipping warm nutrient drinks. They believed with every fiber of their beings that war was something you could master from the safety of a classroom. And for a long time, they were never proven wrong. Then humanity joined the Galactic Union, and a single human walked into the most prestigious military academy in the known galaxy. He did not come to study, he came to teach, and nothing was ever the same again. The Velithari Command Academy sat on the frozen moon of Palakis 7, a world of silver ice and pale blue skies that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was considered the finest military training institution in the entire Galactic Union. Cadets from over 40 species competed for the honor of attending. Admission alone was a mark of distinction. Graduation was a guarantee of command. For 300 years, the Academy had produced the sharpest tactical minds in the galaxy: admirals, fleet commanders, strategic advisors to planetary governments. Its halls were lined with portraits of graduates who had shaped the outcomes of conflicts across a dozen star systems. The curriculum was built around a single philosophy: control. Every lesson, every simulation, every examination reinforced the same idea. War was a system. It had rules. It had predictable patterns. A good officer understood those patterns and used them to control the outcome. Emotion was the enemy. Chaos was the enemy. Uncertainty was something to be eliminated through superior planning and precise execution. The cadets trained in holographic battle rooms where every variable could be measured and every outcome could be calculated in advance. They ran simulations thousands of times until they could predict the result before the first shot was fired. They were taught that the ideal battle was one where victory was assured before it even began. And then the message came from Union Central Command. Director Valith Son, a tall and slender Rithani with deep violet skin and 4 narrow eyes that never seemed to blink, read the communication twice before setting it down on her desk. She leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath through the thin slits on the sides of her neck. The message was simple. As part of a new integration program between the Galactic Union and the recently admitted human species, a human military advisor would be assigned to the Academy for 1 full academic cycle. He would observe, participate, and where appropriate, contribute to the training of senior cadets. His name was Sergeant Major Cale Morrow. He had served 23 years in the Terran Ground Defense Forces. He had seen combat on 9 different worlds. He had been wounded 11 times. He had buried more soldiers than most species had ever commanded. Violet did not know what to make of this. She had heard stories about humans, of course. Everyone had. They were newcomers to the galactic stage, a species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last 40 years. They were considered primitive by most standards. Their technology was functional but unrefined. Their ships were ugly. Their weapons were loud and messy. Their tactics were, according to every analyst who had studied them, reckless and unpredictable. But they had also done something that no one could ignore. In the short time since they had made contact with the wider galaxy, they had fought 3 border conflicts against species that had centuries more experience. They had won all 3. No one could explain how. Valith assembled her senior staff and informed them of the assignment. The reactions were predictable. Instructor Torvan, a massive Korvathi with a shell of armored bone plates across his back, crossed his thick arms and grunted his displeasure. He taught advanced fleet tactics and considered himself the finest military mind on the moon. The idea of a human walking through his halls offended him on a deep and personal level. Instructor Levain, a quiet and graceful Thessary with bioluminescent markings along her arms, was more measured in her response but no less skeptical. She taught strategic theory and believed firmly that war was an intellectual exercise. The idea of learning anything from a species known for brute force seemed absurd to her. Only one member of the staff showed any curiosity. Instructor Drell, a Paxan with 6 limbs and a face like cracked stone, tilted his head and asked a single question. What did the human's combat record actually look like? Valith pulled up the file and displayed it on the holoscreen. The room went silent. The record was not long. It was not decorated with the kind of formal language they were used to. It was blunt. direct, almost uncomfortably simple. But the details spoke for themselves. Cale Morrow had served in the Terran Ground Defense Forces since the age of 19. He had fought in the siege of Venar 4, where a Terran battalion of 800 soldiers held a fortified position against 4,000 Drenari shock troops for 11 days without resupply. He had been part of the counter-offensive on Rylax, where a Terran company used the planet's toxic atmosphere to mask their movements and ambushed a convoy of armored transports that outnumbered them 6-1. He had led a platoon through the tunnels beneath the city of Palok during the Kasari border war, fighting hand-to-hand in complete darkness for 3 days. His body carried the scars of plasma burns, ballistic impacts, chemical exposure, and a collapsed lung that had been repaired with field surgery performed by a medic with no anesthesia and a combat knife. Torvan uncrossed his arms slowly. Levian said nothing. Drell made a low sound in his throat that, among his species, indicated deep respect. Thalith closed the file. The human would arrive in 6 days. She told her staff to prepare the cadets. The cadets, however, were not easy to prepare. The senior class consisted of 42 individuals from 12 different species. They were the best of the best, the brightest minds, the sharpest strategists. They had spent years climbing through the ranks of the academy, surviving grueling examinations and ruthless competition. They were proud. They were confident. And they had already formed their opinions about humans long before Cale Morrow ever set foot on Palaxis 7. The most vocal among them was a cadet named Soreth Fayan. Soreth was a Raithani-like director Vailith, tall and sharp-featured, with skin the color of dark amethyst. He was the top-ranked cadet in the senior class and had never finished below first in any tactical examination. He carried himself with the calm, measured confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged. He had read the intelligence reports on human military operations and found them, in his own words, fascinating in the way a natural disaster is fascinating. Powerful, yes. Effective, certainly. But lacking in elegance, precision, and intellectual depth. His closest companion was a cadet named Thilla Wren, a Thessary, whose bioluminescent markings pulsed in soft patterns of blue and green when she was deep in thought. Thilla was quieter than Soreth, but no less brilliant. She had a gift for reading patterns in chaos, and had once solved a simulated fleet engagement in 9 moves that her instructors had designed to require a minimum of 20. She respected the idea of learning from other species, but struggled to see what a ground soldier could teach cadets who were being trained to command entire fleets. There were others, of course. A Korvathi cadet named Brennix, who was built like a siege engine and had the temperament to match. A Paxan named Chillith, who rarely spoke but whose simulation scores were consistently in the top 5. A pair of Valathari twins named Osk and Ren, who moved in perfect synchronization and specialized in coordinated multi-front engagements. Each of them was exceptional. Each of them was certain of their own abilities, and none of them had ever experienced real combat. The day Cale Morrow arrived, the sky above the academy was the color of pale steel. A small transport shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere and settled onto the landing pad with a hiss of venting gas. The cadets had been assembled in the main courtyard, standing in neat, precise rows, according to species and rank. They wore their dress uniforms, each one immaculate. They stood at perfect attention. The shuttle door opened. Cale Morrow stepped out. He was not what they expected. He was shorter than most of the cadets. He wore a plain, dark uniform with no visible medals or insignia beyond a single patch on his shoulder that bore the emblem of the Terran Ground Defense Forces. His hair was cut short and was beginning to show streaks of grey at the temples. His face was weathered and lined, and there was a long scar that ran from just below his left eye down to the corner of his jaw. His eyes were dark and steady, and they moved across the assembled cadets with a slow, unhurried focus that made several of them shift uncomfortably. He carried no weapons. He carried no datapad. He carried nothing at all except a small bag slung over one shoulder. Director Valeth stepped forward and greeted him formally. She welcomed him to the academy. She spoke of the honor of interspecies cooperation. She expressed her hope that his time here would be productive and mutually beneficial. She delivered the speech with practiced elegance and diplomatic precision. Cale Morrow listened. He nodded once, then he looked past her at the cadets. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at them. His eyes moved from face to face, species to species, taking in every detail. The perfect uniforms, the rigid posture, the polished boots and gleaming insignia, the confidence in their eyes, the certainty. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of voice that had spent years giving orders in places where shouting would get you killed. He said, "Which of you has ever been shot at?" The courtyard was silent. He nodded slowly, as if the silence was exactly the answer he expected. "That is where we are going to start," he said. Soreth Vian, standing in the front row, felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He did not know the word for it. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable. It was the first small crack in a wall he did not know he had built. The cadets were dismissed to their quarters. The first training session with the human advisor was scheduled for the following morning. That night, the barracks were louder than usual. The cadets talked in low voices about what they had seen, about the scar on the human's face, about the way he had looked at them, about that single quiet question that none of them had been able to answer. Thilaren sat on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. Her bioluminescent markings flickered in patterns she could not control, which meant her subconscious was processing something her conscious mind had not yet caught up with. She replayed the moment in her head, the human stepping off the shuttle. The silence after his question, the way his eyes had moved across them not with contempt, but with something that looked almost like sadness. She did not sleep well that night. None of them did. In his small guest quarters on the far side of the campus, Cale Morrow unpacked his bag. He set a folded photograph on the desk beside his bunk. It showed a group of soldiers standing in front of a burned-out building on a world whose name most people in the galaxy had never heard. There were 19 soldiers in the photograph. Cale was one of them. He was the only one still alive. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he turned off the light and lay down in the dark. Tomorrow he would begin teaching these cadets what no simulation could ever show them. Tomorrow he would start breaking down every comfortable lie they had ever been told about war. Not because he wanted to frighten them, not because he wanted to prove that humans were superior, but because somewhere, someday, these cadets would be in command when real blood was being spilled. And when that day came, the difference between what they had learned in their clean, perfect classrooms and what actually happened on a battlefield would be the difference between life and death for the soldiers under their command. He owed it to the 19 faces in that photograph to make sure these cadets understood that. He closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly, the way it always did. And as always, it was not peaceful. The first training session was scheduled in Simulation Hall 3, the largest and most advanced holographic combat environment on the campus. It could replicate any terrain, any weather condition, any combat scenario from any recorded conflict in the last 500 years of galactic history. The processing power behind its walls could calculate millions of variables per second. It could simulate the trajectory of every bullet, the spread of every explosion, the precise moment when a shield generator would overload. It was, by every measure, the most sophisticated training tool in existence. Cale Morrow walked in and looked around. The cadets were already there, seated in rows of curved benches that rose in a half-circle around the central simulation floor. They had their data pads ready. Their posture was straight. Their uniforms were perfect. They looked like students waiting for a lecture. Instructor Torvan stood near the entrance with his arms folded across his massive chest. He had insisted on being present for the first session. He told Director Vaileth that it was to ensure the human did not disrupt the cadets' training schedule. But the truth was simpler than that. He wanted to see what this human thought he could teach to cadets that Torvan had spent 15 years shaping into the finest tactical minds in the galaxy. Cale walked to the center of the simulation floor and stopped. He looked up at the cadets for a moment. Then he spoke. "Yesterday I asked how many of you had been shot at. Nobody answered. Today I have a different question. How many of you have ever lost a simulation?" Several hands went up. About a third of the cadets. Good. And how did it feel? The question seemed to confuse them. One cadet, a Korvathi named Brennex, answered first. He said it felt frustrating, like a puzzle he had failed to solve. He said he had reviewed his mistakes, adjusted his approach, and performed better the next time. Cale nodded. "And when you lost, what happened to your soldiers? The simulated ones?" He said the simulation ended. The casualties were recorded as data points. He reviewed them as part of his post-action analysis. "Data points," Cale repeated. He said it the way someone might say the name of a disease. Then he turned to the simulation console and entered a set of parameters. The holographic environment flickered to life around them. The cadets found themselves standing on the surface of a rocky, barren world. The sky was choked with brown dust. The air shimmered with heat. In the distance, the jagged silhouettes of ruined buildings rose against the horizon like broken teeth. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and dry. There was a smell in the air that the simulation had been programmed to reproduce. Smoke, chemical residue, and something else. Something organic and wrong that most of the cadets could not immediately identify. Cale stood in the center of the group and let them take it in. He waited until the initial curiosity faded and the discomfort began to set in. Then he spoke. This is Vinar 4. Or rather, this is what Vinar 4 looked like on day 8 of the siege. I know because I was here, standing about 200 meters to the east of where we are now, behind a wall of sandbags and wreckage that we had piled up to give ourselves some kind of cover. He started walking. He led them through the ruins of what had once been a small settlement. The buildings were shattered. Walls had collapsed inward. Scorch marks blackened every surface. Here and there, the simulation displayed the remnants of defensive positions, makeshift barricades built from broken furniture and sheets of metal, foxholes dug into the hard ground with tools that were clearly not designed for digging. We arrived on Vinar 4 with 812 soldiers, Ale said, his voice steady and even. Our mission was to secure the settlement and hold it until a resupply convoy arrived. Intelligence told us the enemy had maybe 1,000 troops in the area. Light resistance. Quick operation. He stopped at a collapsed wall and looked at it for a moment. Then he turned to the cadets. Intelligence was wrong. The Drenari had 4,000 shock troops staged in underground bunkers less than 30 kilometers away. They hit us on the second night. Full assault. Armored vehicles, heavy plasma weapons, infantry and powered exoskeletons. We had standard-issue rifles, 2 heavy weapons emplacements, and a communication relay that got destroyed in the first hour of fighting. The cadets followed in silence. Even Sorath, who had prepared several intellectual objections to whatever the human planned to teach, said nothing. For 11 days we held this position. No resupply, no reinforcements, no communication with command. We rationed ammunition. We rationed water. We rationed medical supplies until there was nothing left to ration. On day 5, we started using the weapons we took from dead enemy soldiers because we had run out of our own ammunition. On day 7, we lost the northern perimeter and had to fall back to the inner compound. On day 9, a Drenari assault team breached the eastern wall and we fought them room to room for 6 hours. He stopped again. This time he was standing in front of a low, flat structure that had once been some kind of storage building. The door was gone. The interior was dark. This is where we set up our field hospital. And I use that word loosely. It was a room with a table and whatever medical equipment our medics could carry. By day 8, we had over 200 wounded soldiers in and around this building. Some of them had injuries that would have been routine to treat in a proper medical facility. Plasma burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones. But we did not have a proper medical facility. We had 2 medics, one of whom was working with a broken arm that she had set herself using a piece of pipe as a splint. His expression had not changed. It was calm, controlled. But there was something beneath it that pressed against the surface like water behind a dam. 14 soldiers died in this building. Not from enemy fire, from injuries that we could not treat. They bled out, or they went into shock, or infections spread faster than we could manage with the supplies we had. And every single one of them knew it was happening. They were conscious. They were aware. And they were surrounded by their friends who could do nothing but hold their hands and tell them it was going to be okay, when everyone in the room knew that it was not going to be okay. The silence in the simulation hall was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the simulated environment seemed to fade. Cale let the silence hold for a long time. Then he said, "Your simulations do not include that. Your tactical models do not account for the sound a young soldier makes when they realize they are going to die 3,000 light years from home. Your data points do not capture the weight of writing a letter to someone's family explaining that their child is not coming back. And that is the gap I am here to address." He deactivated the simulation. The ruins of Vinar 4 dissolved into the clean white walls of the simulation hall. The cadets blinked in the sudden brightness. Several of them looked shaken. Tilleren's bioluminescent markings had gone completely dark, which among her species was an involuntary response to profound emotional disturbance. Kale walked to the center of the room and faced them. I am not here to tell you that your training is wrong. It is not. Your tactical skills are exceptional. Your understanding of fleet dynamics, orbital mechanics, resource management, all of it is far beyond anything we teach in human military academies. You are brilliant. I mean that without reservation. He paused. But brilliance is not enough, because war does not care how brilliant you are. War is not a simulation. It is not a puzzle with a correct solution. It is chaos. It is noise and confusion and fear and pain and decisions that have to be made in seconds with incomplete information while people around you are screaming and dying. And the officers who survive that, the ones who bring their soldiers home, are not always the smartest ones. They are the ones who understand what they are asking their soldiers to do. They are the ones who have felt the weight of it, who carry it with them, who never forget that every order they give has a human cost, or a Raithani cost, or a Korvathi cost, or whatever species is standing in front of them trusting them with their lives. That evening, the cadets gathered in the common room of their barracks. The mood was different from the night before. There was less talking and more thinking. Several cadets sat alone, staring at nothing. Others spoke in quiet pairs, their voices low and uncertain. Sarath Vian sat in his usual chair by the window, but he was not reading or reviewing tactical scenarios as he normally did at this hour. He was staring out at the frozen landscape of Palixis 7, watching the pale light of the distant sun slide across the ice fields. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, and for the first time, it looked like a stranger. He had spent his entire academic career building a framework for understanding conflict. It was elegant. It was logical. It accounted for variables, calculated probabilities, and identified optimal outcomes with mathematical precision. He had been proud of it. He had defended it in debates against instructors and fellow cadets alike, and in a single morning a man with a scar on his face and no medals on his chest had walked into that framework and shown him the gaping hole at its center. Living, breathing, frightened people who did not behave like variables in an equation. Dilla approached him and sat down nearby. Her markings had returned to a dim, steady glow, but they were muted. She asked if he was all right. He said he did not know. She said she did not know either. They sat in silence for a while. And that silence said more than any conversation could have had. Across the room, Brenix was doing something unusual. He was sitting still. The massive Korvathi, who was normally in constant motion, running combat drills or lifting weights or pacing the corridors with restless energy, was sitting on a bench with his hands resting on his knees and his eyes fixed on the floor. When his roommate asked if something was wrong, Brennick said he was thinking about something the human had said, about the soldiers who died in the field hospital, about how they were conscious, how they knew. He said he had never thought about that before. In all his years of training, in all the hundreds of simulations he had run, he had never once thought about what it felt like for the soldiers who did not make it out. The next morning, Kael began the second session differently. He did not load a simulation. Instead, he stood at the front of the room with a simple holographic display showing a tactical scenario. A standard fleet engagement, two forces of roughly equal strength meeting in open space near an asteroid belt. The kind of problem the cadets had solved 100 times. He asked for a volunteer to present a solution. Sorath raised his hand. Of course he did. Even shaken, he was still the top-ranked cadet, and his instinct to prove himself was woven into his bones. Orath stood and walked through his solution with practiced confidence. It was elegant. He divided his fleet into 3 strike groups, used the asteroid belt to mask the approach of 2 flanking elements, and timed a coordinated assault that would catch the enemy in a crossfire with no avenue of retreat. He calculated the engagement window down to the second. He estimated casualties at 12% of his total force. He presented it like a masterpiece. Kael listened without interruption. When Sora finished, Kael nodded slowly. 12% casualties, he said. How many ships is that? Sorath checked his numbers. Approximately 14 vessels. And how many crew members per vessel in a standard Union fleet configuration? Sorath hesitated. Between 80 and 300, depending on the class of ship. So, somewhere between 1,100 and 4,200 people, Kael said. Let us split the difference. About 2,500. Does your plan account for search and rescue operations for the crews of those 14 destroyed vessels? Sorath opened his mouth and closed it. The answer was no. His plan optimized for tactical victory. Search and rescue was a post-engagement consideration, a logistics problem, not part of the tactical equation. What about escape pods? Kale continued. In a battle near an asteroid belt, how many escape pods are going to be caught in the debris field? What is the survival time of a standard Union escape pod? How long before the crew inside runs out of breathable air? How long before their distress signals are picked up? And who is going to pick them up? Your fleet, which is now reorganizing after a major engagement, or the enemy's survivors, who may or may not be in a position to take prisoners. Soreth stood very still. His 4 eyes blinked in a rapid pattern that indicated intense cognitive dissonance. Your plan is tactically excellent, Kale said, and there was no mockery in his voice. But it treats casualties as a percentage, a number, an acceptable loss. And I need you to understand something. There is no such thing as an acceptable loss. Every single one of those 2,500 people has a name, a family, a home they were hoping to return to. And the moment you start thinking of them as percentages, you have already failed as their commander. He looked at the rest of the class. I am not telling you to avoid casualties. That is impossible. War produces casualties. That is its nature. What I am telling you is that every tactical decision you make should carry the weight of those lives. You should feel it. It should cost you something. Because the day it stops costing you something is the day you become dangerous in the worst possible way. Not dangerous to the enemy, dangerous to the people who trust you to lead them. The room was quiet. Soreth returned to his seat. For the first time since he had entered the academy, he did not feel like the smartest person in the room. And surprisingly, that did not feel like defeat. It felt like the beginning of something he did not yet have a name for. Over the next several weeks, the sessions continued. Kale introduced the cadets to concepts they had never encountered in their formal training. He taught them about friction, the military theory that no plan survives contact with the enemy. He showed them historical engagements where superior forces had been defeated by inferior ones because of factors that no simulation could predict. Morale, exhaustion, fear, the breaking point of a soldier who had been under fire for too long, the unpredictable courage of a soldier who had nothing left to lose. He taught them about the cost of communication failure. He showed them battles where entire flanks had collapsed because a single relay was destroyed and units could not coordinate. He asked them what their plans looked like when they could not talk to half their fleet. Most of them did not have an answer. He taught them about supply lines, not the abstract theoretical supply lines they studied in logistics class, but the real, physical, vulnerable chains of ships and convoys and fuel depots that kept an army alive. He showed them how the destruction of a single supply convoy could cascade into a disaster that unraveled an entire campaign. He made them calculate not just ammunition and fuel, but food, water, medical supplies, and the psychological impact of soldiers who had not eaten in 3 days. And slowly, something began to change. Not in the cadets' skills. Those were already excellent. But in the way they thought, in the way they approached problems, in the questions they asked before presenting their solutions. Soreth began including evacuation protocols in every tactical plan he designed. Dilla started running her simulations with randomized communication failures to test the resilience of her strategies. Brannox, who had always favored overwhelming force, began designing plans that prioritized the protection of his own units over the destruction of the enemy. Chillith, the quiet Paxson, started asking questions in class for the first time. Hard questions. Questions about what happened to soldiers after a battle was over, about trauma, about the long, invisible wounds that no medic could treat. Even Instructor Torvan noticed the change. He did not like it. He did not like the way the cadets were beginning to question doctrines he had spent his career teaching. He did not like the way they looked at their simulations differently, as if the holographic soldiers on the screen had suddenly become real. He did not like the way they talked about the human with a respect that bordered on reverence, but he could not deny the results. The cadets were performing better, not just in tactical scores, which had always been high, but in the more subtle measures. Their plans were more flexible, more adaptive. They accounted for more variables. They recovered faster from unexpected developments. They were becoming, in a way that Torvan could not quite articulate, more complete as officers. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was what frightened him. The final evaluation was approaching. Every year, the senior class of the Velathari Command Academy faced a culminating exercise that tested everything they had learned. It was the single most important event of their academic careers. The scenario was always designed by the senior instructors and kept secret until the moment of execution. It was meant to be overwhelming. It was meant to push the cadets beyond their limits. And every year, the cadets approached it with the same mixture of anxiety and confidence, knowing that their years of training had prepared them for whatever the instructors could design. This year was different. This year, Director Varlith had done something unprecedented. She had asked Cale Morrow to design the final evaluation. The decision had not been made lightly. Varlith had watched the cadets closely over the past months. She had seen the transformation in their thinking. She had read their tactical submissions and noticed the shift in priorities, the new depth of consideration, the willingness to question their own assumptions. She had also seen the resistance from some of her staff, particularly Torvan, who had formally protested the decision and been overruled. But Varlith understood something that Torvan did not. The galaxy was changing. The conflicts that the Union would face in the coming decades would not look like the clean, predictable engagements of the past. They would be messy. They would be unpredictable. And the officers who commanded Union forces needed to be ready for that reality, not the sanitized version of it that the Academy had been teaching for 300 years. Cale spent 2 weeks designing the exercise. He consulted no one. He used no existing templates. He built it from the ground up, drawing on 23 years of experience in places where the textbooks did not apply. When he submitted the final parameters to Varlith, she reviewed them in silence for a long time. Then she approved them without a single modification. The morning of the evaluation, the cadets assembled in Simulation Hall 3. The atmosphere was tense. They had trained for this moment for years. But there was something different in the air now, a quality of seriousness that went beyond academic ambition. They were not just competing for scores anymore. Something had shifted inside them, individually and collectively, and they carried that shift into the hall like a weight they had chosen to bear. Cale stood at the center of the simulation floor. He looked at them, the same way he had looked at them on his first day. Calm, steady, unhurried. But there was something else in his eyes now. Something that might have been pride, though he would never have used that word himself. "Here is your scenario," he said. "You are the commanding officers of a Union peacekeeping force assigned to the Shelvari system. 3 days ago, a civil war erupted on Shelvari Prime between two factions. Faction 1 controls the Northern Hemisphere and the planet's primary spaceport. Faction 2 controls the Southern Hemisphere and the planet's agricultural zones. Both factions have military forces. Both factions have civilian populations caught in the crossfire. Your fleet consists of 12 vessels. You have 4,000 ground troops, limited medical resources, and a mandate from the Union Council to restore order and protect civilian lives." He paused to let that sink in. There is no enemy fleet to destroy. There is no clear military objective. Both factions claim legitimacy. Both factions have committed atrocities. Both factions have civilians who are starving, wounded, and terrified. Your job is not to win. Your job is to save as many lives as possible while preventing the conflict from escalating. And I will tell you right now that there is no solution that saves everyone. People are going to die no matter what you do. The question is how many, and whether you can live with the choices you make. The simulation activated. The cadets were divided into command teams, each responsible for a different aspect of the operation. Sorth was assigned overall fleet command. Thiller was given charge of intelligence and communications. Brennex commanded the ground forces. Chilith managed logistics and medical operations. The Velithari twins, Osk and Ren, handled orbital coordination and sensor networks. Every cadet had a role. Every role was critical. The scenario began in chaos, and it only got worse from there. Within the first hour, Sorth's fleet detected weapons fire in the capital city of the Northern Hemisphere. Civilian casualties were mounting. Faction 1 was using artillery in a densely populated urban area. Faction 2 was responding with guerrilla attacks that used civilian buildings as cover. Both sides were targeting the other's infrastructure, which meant that hospitals, water treatment plants, and power stations were being destroyed. Thiller's intelligence reports were contradictory and incomplete. Her communication channels were being jammed by both factions. She could not get a clear picture of what was happening on the ground. She had to make assessments based on fragments of data, sensor readings that were hours old, and intercepted transmissions that might or might not be disinformation. Brennex's ground forces were deployed to establish humanitarian corridors, but they immediately came under fire from both factions, neither of which trusted the Union's neutrality. His soldiers were caught between two hostile forces while simultaneously trying to evacuate civilians who were too frightened or too injured to move on their own. He lost simulated soldiers in the first engagement. Real numbers. Real names that the simulation had assigned to each unit. Chilith's medical teams were overwhelmed within the first 3 hours. The wounded were coming in faster than they could be treated. Supplies were running low. The nearest resupply was 4 days away. She had to make decisions about triage that no textbook had prepared her for. Which patients received treatment first? Which ones could wait? Which ones could not be saved and would have to be made comfortable while they died? And through all of it, KL watched. He did not interfere. He did not offer advice. He stood at the edge of the simulation floor with his arms at his sides and observed the cadets as they struggled with the impossible reality he had created for them. The first crisis came 6 hours into the exercise. Action 1 launched a surprise assault on a refugee camp that Brennix's troops had established in a neutral zone. The camp held over 10,000 civilians, mostly families with children. The assault force was small but heavily armed. Brennix had 2 options. He could reinforce the camp, which would require pulling troops from the humanitarian corridors and leaving those corridors unprotected. Or he could hold his positions and hope that the camp's existing security could hold until a rapid response team could be assembled. Brennix froze. For 30 terrible seconds, the massive Korvathi sat motionless at his command station, staring at the holographic display as red icons representing enemy forces closed in on the blue circle that represented 10,000 helpless people. His hands were shaking, not from fear of failure or loss of ranking. From the understanding, drilled into him over the past months by a quiet human with a scar on his face, that those blue icons represented lives, families, children who had done nothing wrong and were about to be caught in the violence of forces they could not control. He made his decision. He pulled 2 squads from the nearest corridor and sent them to reinforce the camp. He personally took command of the defense, coordinating the deployment from his station with a focus and intensity that his instructors had never seen from him before. The corridor he had stripped was attacked within the hour, and he lost soldiers there. Simulated soldiers, data points, except they were not data points anymore. He knew their designations. He had assigned them their positions, and when their icons went dark on his display, he felt each one like a physical blow. The camp held. The corridor did not, and Brennix had to live with both outcomes simultaneously. The second crisis came 12 hours in. Filler intercepted a transmission suggesting that Faction 2 was preparing to deploy a chemical weapon against a Faction 1 military base located adjacent to a civilian settlement. If the weapon was deployed, the chemical agent would spread to the settlement and kill thousands. But the intelligence was unverified. It could be disinformation, designed to provoke a premature Union response. If Soroth committed fleet resources to neutralize the threat and it turned out to be false, he would leave other areas of the operation exposed. Soroth stared at the data. His 4 eyes moved across the display, processing variables, calculating probabilities, running scenarios in his head the way he had been trained to do for years. But this time, the calculation included something it never had before: the faces of the people in that settlement. He did not know them. They were simulated. They were not real. But the weight of their lives pressed against his chest like a physical force, and he understood, in that moment, what Kale had been trying to teach them from the very beginning. He committed the resources. He sent 2 ships to intercept the potential chemical weapon deployment and reassigned ground forces to evacuate the settlement as a precaution. The intelligence turned out to be accurate. The chemical weapon was neutralized before it could be deployed. The settlement was evacuated with minimal casualties. But the redeployment created a gap in the fleet's coverage that Faction 1 exploited to launch a naval attack against a Union supply convoy. Chilith lost half her incoming medical supplies. She adapted. She had to. She redistributed what she had. She prioritized the most critical cases. She made hard choices about who would receive treatment and who would not. And she did it with a steadiness that surprised everyone, including herself. Because she had spent the last months learning that war was not about having enough. It was about making do with what you had and finding a way to keep going when everything told you it was impossible. The exercise ran for 36 continuous hours. The cadets worked in shifts, sleeping in rotation, eating at their stations, never fully disconnecting from the scenario. By the end, they were exhausted. Physically, mentally, emotionally. Their uniforms were wrinkled. Their eyes were red. Their voices were hoarse from hours of issuing orders and coordinating responses. When the simulation finally ended, the holographic displays faded to black and the clean white walls of the hall returned. The cadets sat in their chairs and stared at nothing. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the cooling systems. Cale walked to the center of the floor. He looked at them for a long time. Then he spoke. You lost 418 soldiers. 206 of your wounded did not receive treatment in time and died of their injuries. 11,342 civilians were killed in crossfire bombardment or targeted attacks that you could not prevent. You saved over 160,000. You prevented the deployment of a chemical weapon that would have killed tens of thousands more. You maintained humanitarian corridors that evacuated 78,000 people from active combat zones. You held together a peacekeeping operation in conditions that were designed to break you. He paused. In every military academy in this galaxy, you would be graded on the number of objectives completed, on the efficiency of your resource allocation, on the speed of your decision-making, on the tactical soundness of your deployments. And by those measures, you performed exceptionally. Another pause, longer this time. But I am not going to grade you on those things. I am going to ask you one question, and I want you to think about it before you answer. He looked at each of them in turn. Soreth, Phila, Brennox, Chillith, Osk, and Wren. Every cadet in the room. Do you feel it? But the answer was written on every face in the room. In the dim glow of Phila's markings, in the tight set of Brennox's jaw, in the way Soreth's hands gripped the arms of his chair, in the quiet stillness of Chillith's 6 limbs. They felt it. The weight, the cost. The impossible, crushing burden of holding lives in your hands and knowing that some of them will slip through no matter how hard you try. Cale nodded. Good. That feeling is the most important thing you will ever learn. More important than any tactical doctrine. More important than any fleet formation. More important than any grade you will ever receive. Because that feeling is what separates a commander from a calculator. It is what makes you human. He caught himself and almost smiled. Or whatever your species equivalent of that word is. A small, broken laugh moved through the room, the first sound anyone had made in minutes. Carry it with you, Cale said, every time you sit in a command chair, every time you give an order, every time you look at a tactical display and see icons representing ships and soldiers and civilians. Remember what those icons mean. Remember what they cost. And never, ever let anyone tell you that feeling that cost makes you weak. It makes you worthy of the trust those people place in you. And that trust is the only thing that matters. He turned and walked towards the exit. He stopped at the door and looked back one last time. You are going to be fine, he said. All of you. You were already brilliant when I got here. Now you are something more. And the soldiers you lead one day are going to be lucky to serve under you. Then he walked out. The graduation ceremony took place 3 weeks later. It was a formal affair, attended by dignitaries from across the Union. Director Valeth presided. The cadets received their commissions and their assignments. Soreth was posted to the Union's 2nd Fleet as a junior tactical officer. Tilla was assigned to Intelligence Command. Brennox received a Ground Forces commission. Chillith was placed in charge of a medical logistics unit. Each of them was beginning a career that would take them to the far reaches of the galaxy. Cale Morrow was not at the ceremony. He had left Palax's 7 2 days earlier on a transport shuttle back to Terran space. He had not said goodbye to the cadets individually. He was not that kind of person. He had done what he came to do, and now there were other things that needed his attention. Other soldiers, other wars. Other places where the gap between theory and reality needed to be closed. But he left something behind. Not intentionally. Not as a gift or a gesture. He left it the way a river leaves its mark on stone. Slowly, inevitably, permanently. In the years that followed, the graduates of that class rose through the ranks of the Union military with a speed and distinction that drew attention from across the galaxy. They were different from the officers who had come before them. Their tactical skills were exceptional, as expected of academy graduates. But there was something else. A quality that their colleagues and superiors struggled to define. They made decisions differently. They asked questions that other officers did not think to ask. They treated their soldiers not as assets to be deployed, but as people to be protected. They planned for the worst and hoped for the best. and carried the weight of every decision they made with a seriousness that set them apart. They became known, informally and then formally, as the Morrow class. Soreth Vayan rose to the rank of Fleet Admiral and was credited with resolving the Tessari border crisis without a single shot being fired. When asked by journalists how he had achieved such a remarkable outcome, he said he had learned from someone that the best battle was not the one you won with the fewest casualties, but the one you never had to fight at all. Thilla Wren became the head of Union Intelligence Analysis and redesigned the entire intelligence framework to include what she called human factor modeling, a system that accounted for the psychological and emotional state of both friendly and enemy forces in every strategic assessment. Her peers called it revolutionary. She called it obvious. Brannox commanded the largest ground force deployment in Union history during the Ashanti refugee crisis and evacuated over 2 million civilians from a collapsing planetary system. He lost soldiers. He carried every name with him. He kept a list in a small notebook that he never showed anyone, and when he retired, the notebook went with him. Chilith transformed military medical logistics for the entire Union, creating a rapid response framework that reduced battlefield mortality rates by 40% over the course of a decade. When she was awarded the Union's highest civilian honor, she accepted it in silence and returned to her work the same afternoon. And across the galaxy, in training academies and war colleges and officer briefing rooms, a new philosophy began to take root. It did not have a formal name. It was not written in any textbook, but it spread from officer to officer, unit to unit, fleet to fleet, carried by the graduates of the Morrow class and the officers they trained and the officers those officers trained in turn. It was simple. It was ancient. And it had been waiting for someone to carry it across the stars. War is not a simulation. The people who fight in it are not data points, and the measure of a commander is not how many battles they win, but how many of their soldiers they bring home. On a quiet evening, on a small farm, on the outskirts of a Terran colony world, Cale Morrow sat on his porch and watched the sun set over fields of golden grain that stretched to the horizon. He was older now. His hair was fully grey. The scar on his face had faded to a thin, white line. His hands resting on the arms of his chair were steady. On the table beside him sat a folded photograph of 19 soldiers standing in front of a burned-out building on a world most people had never heard of. He looked at it sometimes in the quiet moments when the day was ending and the sky was soft. He did not speak to them. He did not need to. They knew. They had always known. He had carried them with him into that academy on a frozen moon at the edge of known space. He had carried them into every lesson, every simulation, every quiet conversation in the corridors after class. He had shown those alien cadets what those 19 faces had taught him with their lives. That war is real. That it costs everything, and that the only thing that makes it bearable is the knowledge that someone, somewhere, is trying to make sure it costs as little as possible. The sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned from gold to deep violet. The first stars appeared, and among them, somewhere out there, the officers of the Morrow class were at their posts, watching, leading, carrying the weight. Cale closed his eyes and, for the first time in a very long time, slept peacefully.